Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer, Labour together. Recognisable names, a trifecta of strategic minds steering the Labour Party's modern reinvention. Or a political project marred in scandal, secrecy, and a goal of bringing down Jeremy Corbyn and blunting the electoral chances of a Labour government that seeks change. A coup, you might say. Paul Holden is an investigative journalist dealing with corporate malpractice, a senior researcher of the documentary Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. I spoke to Paul about his upcoming book, The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney, and the Crisis of British Democracy, documenting the rise of McSweeney, Starmer, and the shadow campaign that targeted Jeremy Corbyn and the left. What inspired you to write The Fraud? And also, what was the most surprising discovery during your investigation into Labour and Keir Starmer's rise to power?
Sure. So the investigation was prompted sort of out of the blue by the fact that in 2021, 2022, I sort of lucked into this very substantive leak of documents out of the Labour Party. Now, my background, I'm originally from South Africa, but I've been living in the UK for about 15 years. I've been working as an investigative journalist. Um, Primarily, my work has focused on sort of like really grand scale, grand corruption, what we call in South Africa state capture. And my sort of interest in the work that I do is about broadly the health of our democratic systems, whether they are robust, whether they are being corrupted or subverted by malicious actors, whether it's corruption or some other malfeasance. Um, and when I came across this leak, my sense was that, following the Labour Party from afar, although I was a member for quite a while, was that there would be loads of gossip in there. There'd be loads of just sort of like tittle tattle and like people being mean to each other, large amounts of factionalism, obviously, which is, material, but not necessarily rising to the level of stuff that I normally investigate. Um, but then I realized, going through those materials, that there was something really profound and quite scary that I'd uncovered, which is essentially what I call the Labour Together project, which I could speak about a bit more. But effectively, what I discovered was that there had been this political project that started in 2017 to effectively take over the Labour Party, and I was astonished by the level of wrongdoing that was involved in that campaign, and I was worried about potential violations of electoral law, and I felt like that project had taken a party that was not nearly what wasn't necessarily perfect, but effectively captured it and run it as part of a sort of a pretty lawless and reckless subversion of our democratic process in ways that have now produced very problematic, controversial outcomes. I actually think this project has produced a moment of crisis for our democracy, which may have really disturbing results. May empower the far right. I think we've seen this very worrying clampdown on civil liberties. So actually, what I discovered in that work and that investigation, looking at that material, was this really deep and profound, quite scary political project. And I felt an urgent need to warn people about this project in its fullness, so that we can take prophylactic measures to deal with it.
So essentially, beforehand, you thought, okay, because every political party has factions, and you're going to find that in the Labour Party, you're going to find sort of tit for tat stuff. But what you found was something beyond just factionalism. And are you saying this is far worse than you've seen in other political parties?
It's definitely far worse than I was ever expecting when I looked into this material. So maybe I'll concretize it and speak about a specific story. So the heart of my book is really this guy Morgan McSweeney, and Morgan McSweeney is now the chief of staff to the British Prime Minister. Andrew Marr describes him as the most powerful person in Labour Party history, which is pretty chilling if you know the story. And in 2017, he went to go work for this think tank called Labour Together, which up until then had actually been quite like a noble endeavor. I'd spoken to the founders of Labour Together, who put it together in 2015. And the idea behind Labour Together was actually to try and find a way to unite the Labour Party's various factions, which had been splitting apart after the election of Jeremy Corbyn. But McSweeney is a pretty hardline operator. He comes from a very pretty marginal faction in the party, sort of a Blairite anti-welfare, um, conservative, wing of the party. So to give an example, Morgan McSweeney was the campaign chief for Liz Kendall when she ran for leader in 2015, and she got 4.5% of the vote. That's actually the level of popular support that his politics and his faction's politics have, right? 4.5% of the Labour Party membership, which translates into 1% of the population would actually support this politics. And I think that part of what we see now, the Labour Party's historic collapse in support, is precisely because people are realizing, oh dear, we didn't actually vote for what we thought we were voting for. We voted for this sort of Kendallite politics. But for people like Morgan McSweeney, 2017 is this moment of crisis because Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party has done much better than expected in the general election in 2017. And Morgan McSweeney's had a long history in the Labour Party, effectively would be rendered powerless, and really have no prospects in the party on a long-term basis of accruing power under a Corbynite majority. So he sets out from July 2017 alongside a couple of close allies, Steve Reid MP, who's now the housing minister, sort of his closest political ally, to recapture the Labour Party using Labour Together. Which, again, there's factions in the party, people press for power all the time, but there was something very unique about this. The first is that it's entirely based on misdirection and lies. So Labour Together, the entire time that it's pursuing the secret project to destroy the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, with the very clear and explicit understanding that if Corbyn's Labour Party beats the Tories, that would be a problem for them. So they're looking to destroy the Labour Party's ability to beat the Tories. Effectively, they're mobilizing to try and make sure the Labour Party loses the next general election. But in public, they're saying we're a cross-party unifying factions. We're doing these kumbaya meetings to make sure everybody on the left and right talks to each other. And they develop this quite sophisticated and quite convincing public face where they say, all we're trying to do is heal the Labour Party's divisions, when actually the entire time they're working secretly to inflame those divisions and use pretty despicable methodologies to do so, which I'll speak about in a bit, inflaming ethnic tensions, inflaming the antisemitism crisis in particular, so they can benefit from the chaos. And the second thing is that for this entire period of time, between July 2017 and mid-2020, Labour Together is taking in loads and loads and loads of money from millionaire and billionaire donors. And between early 2018 and mid-2020, Labour Together stops reporting its donations to the Electoral Commission, which is plainly illegal. You have to report your donations over £7,500 to the Electoral Commission. And if you don't, you're breaking electoral law. And they don't report any of those donations. So nobody has any idea at the time that Labour Together has £740,000 in donations. And it's not declaring in violation of the electoral law. And what it's using that to do is two things. One, destroy the Labour Party from within. And two, incubate the leadership of Keir Starmer. So that's sort of the beginning of this pretty sordid story of how this very profound act of unlawful conduct provides the funding and the resources for two linked campaigns to destroy the Labour Party and get Keir Starmer elected leader as the Labour Party once it's been effectively destroyed by losing the 2019 general election. This is very different from a Momentum or a Progress or a Labour to Win, which does everything legally, right? It's declaring donations and does everything publicly. It's saying who they are, and they're arguing in the court of public opinion to win an debate. This is a political project that knows that if they present their own political opinions and desires in public, they will lose. So they use other methods to win.
So, of course, Labour Together is a big thrust of your book. It's a big thrust of, as you said, the Morgan McSweeney project. Why were they not investigated further? Because this now transcends the Labour Party. So what does this say about the state? The fact that they basically got away with hiding money.
And they pretty much did. So there was an investigation by the Electoral Commission in 2021, and the Electoral Commission found them guilty. So we could say, as a fact, it's not an opinion that Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney and his co-directors, which included Steve Reid and Lisa Nandy, were violating the law by making sure that, they were violating the law in that Labour Together wasn't reporting its donations. So the Electoral Commission did investigate, but they effectively gave them a slap on the wrist. They gave them a fine of £14,000. Didn't refer the matter onwards to any other authorities, pretty much let it lie. Now, there's a couple of things there that I have a problem with. One is that Labour Together, in its response to the Electoral Commission, said, this is all a big error. This is all a big mistake. It was administrative oversight and human error is what they say. The Labour Together just forgot somehow to report this enormous amount of money. And I don't think that that's a satisfactory excuse. I'm certainly very skeptical of it. And what I do in the book is I present what I think is pretty compelling evidence that at the very least raises the possibility that it's as plausible, just as plausible, that they purposely didn't declare the money. And I present, I think, pretty compelling evidence to show that. And I'll give you an example, if I may. So, one thing I did was in 2023, I put in FOIs to the Electoral Commission, Freedom of Information requests. And I said, please, can you give me all the correspondence between the Electoral Commission and Morgan McSweeny from 2017 onwards, just pretty much when he takes over the organizations, sort of he runs it, and he's working there full time. And the Electoral Commission sent me back this incredible stuff, because what it shows is in November 2017, Morgan McSweeny called the Electoral Commission and he said to them, I don't think the Labour Together should report donations. We're not a campaigning organisation. We're not public facing. I don't want to report donations. And the Electoral Commission wrote back to him and said, okay, we've checked the records. No, you've got MPs on your board. Your majority of your board is MPs. You are a members association. You have to report donations. You have to report donations over this amount. This is how you report donations. These are the forms you fill in. And then there's actually an extended period of correspondence between Morgan McSweeny and the Electoral Commission, where the Electoral Commission is repeatedly reminding him of his duties to report donations. McSweeny keeps on messing them up. He's filling in the forms wrong, and they're telling him how to do it. So it's clear, it's absolutely clear for this period that over months, Morgan McSweeny is told, yes, you must report donations. And he's aware that he must report donations because he's engaging with them this entire time. So how does a man who's supposed to be like one of the greatest political operatives of the last generation be so useless at his job that he's been told and he knows he has to report donations and he just doesn't? But then there's other things as well, which is that he and Labour Together are telling people they're reporting donations when they're not. So on Labour Together's website, it says, we are reporting donations. Go have a look at the Electoral Commission. Have a look at these donations. And then there's a meeting in Parliament in early 2019 where Morgan McSweeny is asked by MPs, does Labour Together report its donations? And he says, yes, we are reporting our donations. And again, in February 2020, Shabana Mahmood writes an article on behalf of Labour Together where she says, again, we report our donations, go have a look at the Electoral Commission, none of which is true. So I think at a basic level that there are questions about whether the Electoral Commission accepted the human error argument, and if so, was it a reasonable thing for them to accept? The second thing, slightly more complicated, is that there is this now quite famous email, infamous email, called the Shamash email. And it's called the Shamash email because it's an email sent from Gerald Shamash, who's a solicitor for Labour Together, to Morgan McSweeny in 2021, as Labour Together is being investigated by the Electoral Commission. And it's quite a complicated letter, and it's quite hard to read and make sense of, and you sort of have to really study it and make sense. But generally speaking, the thing that I think you can pretty reliably and reasonably take away from it is that there are internal discussions about not disclosing all the material facts to the Electoral Commission about why they failed to report donations. So that then raises the question, did the Electoral Commission even have all the facts at their disposal when they made that decision? And I think those two things together suggest that the Electoral Commission's investigation has not been complete, that the sanction is not sufficient, that it should be reopened and reconsidered with the idea of bringing a fresh sanction and maybe even referring it on to other authorities if they find additional problems. And what I'm very concerned about is that the Electoral Commission, which has rejected the first request for this to happen, I think on very spurious grounds, but has been utterly untransparent about the way it reached its decision. So since 2022, I've submitted, I think it's now 3 or maybe even 4 FOI requests to the Electoral Commission saying, can you at least provide us with a copy of the report that you wrote explaining how you reached this decision on Labour Together? And they refused to release it. Again, I think on pretty ridiculous grounds. Even though they've released other reports, Momentum was investigated, they released that report. Believe was investigated, Leave EU was investigated, they released those reports. There's no reason for these things not to be released, I don't think. So we sit here with this really, I think, a pretty problematic situation where you've had this pretty profound violation of the law that I don't think has been properly policed. I don't think the sanction is appropriate. I think it should be reinvestigated. I think at the very least what we deserve as the British public is to know how the Electoral Commission reached its decision and what Labour Together was telling the Electoral Commission. Until we have that, I think we're living in like a total information and democratic deficit.
I mean, I think we need to speak about the role of the media, because during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and we're going to speak about the anti-Semitism crisis in a second, right? But that was really trumped up by the media. And the question I want to ask you is, how much of the people within Morgan McSweeney and the team around him kind of infiltrated the media, spoke to their friends in the media and kind of pushed them to push these stories? How much of an influence do you think that was versus standard corporate media malpractice, that they didn't really know they were pushing a biased story, but they just weren't particularly interested in hearing the side of the left wing, since the left wing are seen as unserious political actors? I think it's a mixture of the two, but in your estimation, which is the bigger influence?
I will say this. So the context in which Labour Together operates. So in 2017, when this Labour Together project, which I specifically identify as Morgan McSweeney and Steve Eden, one and two other people, the context in which they're operating is that they are playing politics on easy mode, in the sense that they are part of a factional project that has widespread support in the media, in that most of the media, generally speaking, is either distrustful or disdainful of Jeremy Corbyn and his politics, is, I think, quite freaked out by the 2017 general election about the real prospect that actually, there was this generalized assumption, I think, in the media and the political class that when Jeremy Corbyn actually faced the British public for the first time in a general election, he'd be annihilated. And the fact that June 2017 happens and he gets over 40% of the vote, which is only a third time the Labour Party has ever gotten over 40% of the vote since 1974, right? Only Tony Blair has achieved that figure, right? Is a moment in which I think a lot of people sort of lose their minds, because this is now like a realistic threat. You're going to have this like anti-imperialist socialist leader backed by a bunch of cranky left-wingers taking power. That's certainly how they would see it, not how I would see it. So in that context, when Labour Together starts to do its work, they are going to be getting a receptive hearing. But it is very clear that from at least early 2018, McSweeney, and there's a guy he works with very closely called Imran Ahmed, who used to be a Labour Party staffer, are very assiduous in placing stories in the media. And in fact, it does seem like quite a substantial portion of the media stories that would undermine Jeremy Corbyn, specifically around the issue of anti-Semitism, were being seeded by Morgan McSweeney and Labour Together. And I mean, what I find remarkable about that is just like, understand journalism is complicated. I understand you have to protect your sources. But in certain cases, it's taken like close to a decade for us to understand that was actually happening. It's only really in certain stories, it's Gabriel Pogren and Patrick Maguire's book, Get In, where they disclose that there's a number of stories that McSweeney had helped to write or helped to research that appeared in the Sunday Times and the Times for the first time. And that's 7 years later, right? I feel like that new discovery of McSweeney's role in the media has led me to have a pretty profound reconsideration of just how problematic the project was, and also how I think the media did us a real disservice, because it was repeatedly failing to tell us who was behind this stuff, right? And there's a real issue. There's an additional issue here, which I deal with in my book, which is that the anti-Semitism crisis, which then really undermines the Corbyn project and sort of taints its soul in a sense. I think it's the thing that for a lot of people it takes a project that they may not like, but they can sort of see some value in it, and it turns it into this like racist nightmare that needs to be defeated. It's very effective in creating that impression. And the anti-Semitism crisis is made up of sort of a number of different allegations that come together to make a broader allegation. But at the heart of that discursive formation is this idea of denialism. And denialism is this idea that by late 2018, early 2019, there's such a bedrock of absolutely solid information showing that Corbyn's anti-Semitic, that the Labour Party is anti-Semitic, that if you question that in any sort of meaningful way, or you say, I don't think that reporting is particularly accurate, or I think you're being alarmist, or I think you're cherry-picking some stories, then you're a denialist. You're denying the existence of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which either makes you anti-Semitic yourself, or at the very least, it makes you unconcerned with anti-Semitism in ways that impacts negatively on the Jewish community. And there's a key theme throughout this entire period, if you look at the contemporaneous reporting and social media, is there's loads and loads and loads of ordinary members, including loads of Jewish members, who are saying, this anti-Semitism crisis doesn't entirely feel legit to me. There's clearly organic, legitimate elements as issues to be dealt with here, but there seems to be that we worry that there are ulterior motives and there are hidden actors. And then that was treated as an anti-Semitic statement. So you have loads of Jewish people in particular who are called anti-Semitic because they say, we think there's a hidden hand here. But the thing is, the Labour Together project was the hidden hand, or at least was a hidden hand, because we know now for certain that Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney were working out of the public eye to place a whole series of stories about anti-Semitism, which if you go and read them again now, aren't amazing, don't particularly stand up to a huge amount of critical scrutiny. And it creates this like totally Kafkaesque mess in the Labour Party, and I think still afflicts our society in a very profound way. The way they sort of went to war on like the basic conceptions of our shared truth in order to win political power using the vector of anti-Semitism, I think is very disturbing.
I mean, the big thrust of the anti-Semitism crisis was with the EHRC and their findings. Talk to me about that. I mean, a lot of people criticised, including me, the findings. It was flawed. It seemed politically motivated. So, I mean, in your view, was it deliberately motivated against Jeremy Corbyn's Labour?
If you look at the party files, is that the Labour Party's own staff at the time who are responding to the EHRC's investigation are astonished at the sort of the level of what they saw as hostility and the sort of the weird focuses of the EHRC, the weird fixations of the EHRC on like Corbynite actors and not anybody else. So I'll give you a good example, which is that basically the period of time the EHRC is investigating is between 2016 and 2020. For 2 of those years, the Labour Party bureaucracy is run by people who are pretty hostile to Jeremy Corbyn, like really hostile. And the General Secretary is a guy called Ian McNicol, who's very anti-Corbyn. And then for 2 years thereafter, 2018 to 2020, it's run by the Corbynite sort of bureaucracy. Jenny Form becomes in as General Secretary. And the EHRC is supposed to be looking at this whole period. And actually, the offences that they end up focusing in on mostly occurred during the McNicol bureaucracy. But the EHRC goes to, it's one of the incredible exchanges to talk about in the book, where they go and they say, you must give us all the WhatsApp conversations of these people who are involved in handling anti-Semitism complaints. And it's like Jeremy Corbyn, it's the head of legal at the time, Gordon Adele, it's all sorts of people. What they don't do is ask for the WhatsApp conversations, the email conversations of any of the McNicol bureaucracy people. So, and the question has to ask, well, why aren't you interested in what the McNicol bureaucracy had to say? And in fact, if you look at the final EHRC report, even though the majority of offences happened under sort of the 2016 to 2018 period, Ian McNicol's not mentioned once in the final report. Jenny Form is mentioned over 30 times. Now, I also have major problems with EHRC's findings. Like they really, from a legal and factual standpoint, don't really add up. And I have a whole chapter where I effectively discuss and dismantle the EHRC's findings because they really are based on a series of pretty basic factual errors. One example is they find the Labour Party guilty of harassment because a councillor called Pam Bromley had posted online on her Facebook that she thought the anti-Semitism crisis was being overstated for political reasons, which we now is at least arguable based on what we know about Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney's role. And they say, well, this person was a councillor, she was an agent of the party, and as an agent of the party as a whole is responsible for her conduct. The problem is she wasn't an agent of the party because she'd already been suspended when she made those comments. Like, that's a basic error of fact, right? The EHRC found the Labour Party guilty for the conduct of an agent who wasn't an agent of the party, which actually, if you read the EHRC report, is in the EHRC report itself, but they seem to ignore this fact. It's an astonishing oversight that I can't wrap my head around. But I think there's another aspect to the EHRC report, which is that, it was held up, certainly by Starmer and his part of the bureaucracy as incontrovertible proof of the anti-Semitism crisis, that it showed that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn indirectly discriminated against Jewish people and harassed Jewish people. And this was supposed to be this incredibly serious offense, and they would never repeat it again. And what I discovered in the book is that is that they did repeat those offences pretty much immediately after HRC report is accepted. Like the HRC report is one of these moments of extraordinary cynicism, because on the one hand, Starmer literally is giving a speech when it's announced saying, this is a stain on our party, this is a stain on our reputation. I will make sure the leader and deputy leader never have any role in handling anti-Semitism complaints again. And then half an hour later, they're intervening materially in Jeremy Corbyn's suspension. And that to me speaks to a political project that like really has no scruples and has no consistency in the way they treat anti-Semitism, as found by the EHRC, or indirect discrimination. And I think casts this entire period into a pretty profound question, because I really feel like it speaks to a political project that was very cynical and reckless in the way they used anti-Semitism to achieve power, and have been cynical and reckless in the way that they have effectively ignored the findings of the EHRC for whatever political ends they want to pursue. And I think it's pretty despicable.
In your book, you describe Stop Funding Fake News as an AstroTurf campaign. And I think when it comes to Morgan McSweeney, Labour Together, the EHRC, that's a bit more well known to the public. Other people might not know what you mean by this. So can you tell me about Stop Funding Fake News, why you think they're an AstroTurf campaign, and how it's impacted the sort of broader media landscape and trust in journalism?
I mean, it's one of the secret projects that I find the most problematic. So basically, what happens is when Morgan McSweeney goes to Labour Together in 2017, he produces this planning document internally, which sets out how they're going to destroy Corbynism on the one hand, and how they're going to then plan for Corbynism's replacement, which is eventually Keir Starmer. And one of the things that McSweeney says is that Corbynism is powerful because it has all the structural institutional support. In particular, there's a powerful left-wing informational ecosystem that supports Corbynism, which is both social media, but also independent media websites and media outlets like the Canary. And he identifies the Canary in particular as the biggest sort of institutional support basis for Corbyn's politics. And he basically says we need to destroy the Canary if we're going to be successful in our project. He says that literally we have to destroy the Canary. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that some reporting and some versions of this history sort of half imply that maybe this is a bit questionable, but actually the Canary they're a bunch of cranks and they deserve to be destroyed, so maybe we shouldn't be kicking up too much of a fuss about it. But that ignores is two things. One is that one of the things that Morgan McSweeney was most scared about was that the Labour Together's secret project would be discovered, and he was particularly worried about the Canary discovering them, which to my mind speaks to him understanding that the Canary is full of really good investigative journalists who might poke holes in his plan. Right. The second thing is the Canary is a legitimate media organization, loads of great journalists who work there who have now subsequently gone on to places like Declassified, where they've been breaking great stories on Israel Gaza. They regulated by Impress, which is like the gold standard of press regulation in the country. By the time they're being attacked by Morgan McSweeney, they've published 10,000 articles. This is a legit organization, even if you don't necessarily agree with their editorial approach or their bias. This is an organization breaking the news, and if they make mistakes, they correct them. Right? It's a legitimate news organization. So what Morgan McSweeney does to destroy the Canary, and it really is just an utterly reprehensible campaign, is that he starts working with this guy, Imran Ahmed, and they start working in January 2019. And they create this campaign called Stop Funding Fake News. And Stop Funding Fake News is pretty basic. It's a website and it's a Twitter account. And what they do is they go on Twitter and they say, they put together these evidentiary threads against the Canary, and then they tag in the Canary's advertisers, and they say to like Macmillan Cancer Charity, do you know you're advertising on the Canary? Do you know the Canary is a fake news website that promotes hate? Right. Which is in and of itself problematic, because I think that's not accurate. But the other additional problem is that Stop Funding Fake News doesn't declare who's behind it at all. In fact, what they say is that we're just a bunch of activists. We're just a bunch of grassroots actors who are looking to fight hate and misinformation. And they run like this for a year. There's no indication at all for the first year that Stop Funding Fake News runs who's behind it. And how far, the reason I call it an AstroTurf organization is because they're not activists. They are extremely well-connected political actors. So they are and to reel through their connections. Morgan McSweeney, company secretary of Labour Together, alongside multiple sitting MPs who are also directors of the same organisation. Labour Together, which is not declaring its funding, is providing resources to stop funding fake news. The person he's working with, Imran Ahmed, used to work for the Labour Party and subsequently works for an organisation called the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which goes around the world advising governments on online safety laws. They are supported by Steve Reed, MP, who endorses the campaign on the day it launches. He's a sitting Labour Party MP, and he's a company director of Labour Together. And Labour Together is taking in loads of money from millionaires who've been donating to right-wing Labour Party causes. So this is about as far away from a grassroots campaign as you can possibly imagine. And of course, if people at the time knew that the Canary was being attacked by these political actors, the Canary could say, well, of course they disagree with our reporting. They don't like us. They're from a different faction. And in fact, the Canary would be able to say, not just they don't like us, but the Canary has reported on McSweeny and Ahmed's political allies accurately but critically in the past. Right. But not anonymity means that nobody can draw those inferences. It also means that the targets of Stop Funding Fake News are denied any legal protection because it's plain Stop Funding Fake News is defaming the Canary, absolutely plain. But the Canary can't sue anybody because they don't know who's behind it. And it would take a lot of money to get Twitter or web servers or web registrars to share up the information of who's behind this organization. And that's assuming that Stop Funding Fake News is even registered with a legitimate email address, right? So basically, it denies the Canary any chance of response. And the worrying thing is it's really, really, really successful. So Stop Funding Fake News massively cuts the Canary's advertising revenue. And the Canary has to fire a whole bunch of legitimate journalists from a very diverse newsroom as a result of this campaign. And Stop Funding Fake News celebrates this. They brag about the way they've basically destroyed the lives and careers of these legitimate journalists doing public interest journalism. I mean, it's an incredibly disturbing story in and of itself, but it's disturbing because this is a project that's in the absolute DNA of the project that then makes Keir Starmer leader. And I think all of those tendencies within Stop Funding Fake News of being censorious, authoritarian, having zero tolerance for dissent or debate, using whatever means possible to win power, those then get carried through into the rest of the Starmer project.
Now, excerpts of your book were reported to the mainstream media, namely Diane Abbott, and obviously those emails in which you've received pretty disgusting abuse, sexist abuse. Did you have, or were you targeted from Morgan McSweeney or those around him when those excerpts came to light?
Not when those excerpts came to light, but actually quite a bit earlier. What happened was that, it's a pretty astonishing story. In November 2023, I went to the Sunday Times with a story. Basically, I wanted the Sunday Times to do a story about Morgan McSweeney and the undeclared money, and I had a whole bunch of these leaked documents, which I think spoke to the fact that, I think raised issues around whether the funding hadn't been declared on purpose or not. And the Sunday Times ran a story, a front page story about the election guru who got Starmer power with undeclared money. And at the bottom of that article, it said, this article is based on documents provided by Paul Holden, who's writing a book. And then at the same time, my publisher put up a little blurb about my book. And then I started writing articles with a journalist called Matt Taibbi in the States about Stop Funding Fake News. And what I didn't know at the time, which I subsequently found out, was 8 months later, I got a call from a friend of mine from South Africa, this just absolutely phenomenal investigative journalist, and she said to me, at the time she'd been working on this investigation into British companies, reputation management firms, and various sort of private security firms they subcontract to. And the role these reputation management firms play is that big corporations, arms companies and Shell and, Elbit or whatever, will hire these reputation management firms to make sure they don't receive any negative press, but also to manage situations where there are whistleblowers or there's journalists who are looking into something. And she told me, to my great surprise, that your name has come up in my investigation. And I was like, really? This is mad to me. How's my name come up? She said, no. One of the companies that I've been investigating that does this sort of work was hired to look into you and look into your family. And then she mentioned my partner's sister's name. And I was like, how do you know my partner's sister's name? She's like, yeah, because they were talking about her, which then proved to me that they were looking into my family. This person from South Africa doesn't know anything about my family. So for her to know my partner's sister name, I was like really taken aback by it. So I said to her, well, who was the client? She said it was Labour Together. And what she told me was that in November 2023, Labour Together hired this reputation management firm to effectively deal with me, in the sense that they were trying to find what I knew, how I knew it, what else I was going to say. And initially, I was still pretty skeptical. And then my friend started sending me some reports from this reputation management firm, which showed the ways in which they were investigating me. And it's clear what they'd done. They'd gone into like a deep dive into my family, into my professional colleagues, trying to find, really, as far as I could establish, certainly the way I read it, is that they were trying to find anything that could be used to paint me in a negative light. And certainly there's one of the reports I see, like, really took these tiny little fragments of information and tried to weave them into a story that I was somehow this like biased political activist with an axe to grind, rather than like an anti-corruption investigator. And what it spoke to, I think, I was very shocked when I first found it, and I was quite disturbed, because obviously I was only told after the election in 2024. So I'm told that Labour Together, which is a long association with McSweeny, has been looking into me and my family after Morgan McSweeny and Keir Starmer have effectively won power, and that was a pretty disturbing thing. Over time, I think I've gotten more. I don't think I'm relaxed about it, because plainly there's no dirt to find on me, right? Like, I'm a pretty straight guy. I've done loads of, I work with law enforcement loads. My career, I think, is pretty. I'm proud of the work that I've done, but I think it's very respectable, in the sense that I've done loads of work with big international outlets like the Guardian, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, Al Jazeera. I'm not worried about my past or what might come up, because there really is nothing to come up at all. But what I do think it showed was just, I think I'd worried them. I think I'd gotten under their skin. And the question I then asked myself was like, what sort of think tank behaves like this? And then I thought to myself, well, it's a think tank that is worried about what might come up if you start digging into them. That's how I read it, at least. That was my opinion when I read that material.
Wow. Paul, thank you so much for coming on Turn Left. Really interesting. Where can people pick up your book?
Sure. So right now it's for sale from the All Books website, orbooks.com. And you can buy an ebook now, or pre-order the book. It's just come off pre-sale, and it will be in most major bookstores in the UK, in Waterstones, and independent bookstores from the beginning of November as well.
Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.